Guys, it's Crystal. I hope you guys are all doing well this week. I hope you guys have been outside enjoying the nice fall weather and looking at the colored leaves. I hope that everything has been going well for you. If you're celebrating Thanksgiving this weekend, happy Thanksgiving, and I hope you guys get to enjoy lots of good food. If you're new to this channel, like I said, my name is Crystal and I do Canadian true crime or true crime with a Canadian twist. From time to time, like in these next few weeks, I also focus on international crimes, ones that interest me, ones that other people have recommended, and we are going to get to some recommendations in November, and ones that show the differences in the criminal systems from different places. You guys know I'm from Canada, so our system is different from the US. It's slightly different from England, it's different from Japan, it's different from many places. So sometimes I do it just to highlight that. Like I said, we are going to be focusing this month on Shocktober. That's what we've been calling it. So these are more shocking crimes, and most of them will be international, guys. Unfortunately, I thought that this case would only take 2 weeks, but it's going to take 3. So we might have to slip one more in that first week of November. I hope that's okay with you guys. So hopefully you guys will like these videos. Hopefully you'll ring the notification bell. That might work, might not. Hopefully you'll subscribe if you already haven't, and leave me some comments. You guys know I always say it, particularly about this case. We are right smack in the middle of the Fred and Rose West case. And if you guys are returning subscribers, you guys already know how thankful I am for you and how much I love you. And just how great that this has been to share these things with you guys. I know that I talk a lot, sometimes on tangents, and I know I don't have all the technology that everybody does, but thank you for coming aboard and listening to my stories. So, like I said, Fred and Rose West, guys. Oh, also, just for YouTube, these are for entertainment or educational purposes only. There are many trigger warnings, particularly for the Fred and Rose West case, guys. There's lots of torture, there's abuse of animals, actually. There's child abuse, things of that nature. So if that does trigger you, Fred and Rose West might not be the ones that you guys want to stick around for. Just have to put that out there. And I do have some pictures too. And like I said, if you guys do, if you guys do leave some comments, please no hate. There's enough hate out there in the world already. We don't need to add to it. We're just here to talk. So Fred and Rose West, last time that we left them, they had finally gotten together. Now, Fred had lived quite a life before he even met Rose. So had Rose. They had both come from abusive families, although I do want to point out that Rose's family was, in my opinion, even worse than Fred's was. We do know that both of them probably suffered, I have to say, from some type of brain injury. We know especially for Fred because he had the motorcycle accident that did cause a skull fracture and things of that nature. And also because he fell from the balcony when he was trying to grope that girl. So he had at least 2 incidents of that. And people did say that his personality definitely changed. We know with Rose, her mother had electroconvulsive therapy while she was pregnant with her. So that probably changed some of the brain patterns as well. Regardless, it doesn't excuse what the 2 of these people did. Now, we already know that Fred has murdered his pregnant mistress, because currently at this point in time, he is still married to Rena. He murdered his pregnant mistress, Anne McFall. And we also, on his own, this was before he met Rose. And we also know that Rose murdered Charmaine, which would be Rena's oldest daughter. Guys, she had to have, because Fred was still in prison at this point. So it's interesting to note that they both murdered someone separately from each other, although Charmaine was attached to Fred. I don't think she did it at his behest. It doesn't sound like that. I think she just did it because she wanted to do it. And as a way to get rid of a problem, Char was very defiant towards her. And you guys have to remember, Char was only 8 years old too. So we do know that this happens, and currently right now, as we speak, Fred was released from prison because when he got out, he actually helped dispose of Charmaine's body. So I'm just going to show you guys right now while I have them. Right there is a picture of Charmaine, and right here is a picture of Anne McFall. Anne McFall, like you guys know, was never reported missing, nor was Charmaine, mostly because people thought that Charmaine was with Rena. That was the story that Fred and Rose concocted. They even told Anna that. And we also know that Anne McFall had written letters to her parents saying that she thought she'd have a better life with Fred West. So they didn't question anything either. And he did, one of them did, he did. It had to have been him, removed the fetus actually from her body. Fred has this love of looking inside women. He, not men, guys. He specifically has a very keen interest in female anatomy, the inner workings of it. So let's get down to it, guys. So it's interesting at this point, though, for us to compare Rose and Rena. The reason being is that we know that Rena was up for anything. I know she was beaten horribly by Fred and things of that nature, but anything sexually, she was up for. It didn't matter what it was. Anything, everything, any position, group sex, it didn't matter. Anywhere Fred wanted her to have sex with other men, because she was working as a prostitute at this point in time, but she was also doing the same thing Rose was doing. Fred had a very good way, let's just say, of persuading women to do what he wanted. And he was able to do this with both Rena and Rose. In my opinion, though, I believe that Fred used Rena against Rose because Rena was willing to do anything and everything sexually, etc., etc. Fred, more than likely, I can't say for sure, would bring this up to Rose in order to push her into doing these things and into going even farther than Rena. That was his MO. He even said at one point in time, because Rose was 15 and a half when they met, he even said he got Rose and trained her the exact way he wanted her to. And yes, she appears to be servile to Fred, but I don't want you guys to mistake that, because she definitely had dominance. We know that Fred at this point in time has murdered Anne McFall. This was actually one of the points in times when he and Rena lived together. We know that due to the beatings and things of that nature, she often left Fred and the girls and would return to Glasgow in Scotland, where she was from, or go to various other places. But she always came back for the girls, guys. And this was when the beatings were particularly harsh, that she usually up and left. I don't know how long she left for. I would assume it was months, weeks for sure, if not months. But there is some conjecture, I don't believe it's true, that maybe she helped murder Anne McFall. I know she didn't particularly care for her. And it could be argued that Fred told Rose about the murder of Anne McFall and said that Rena helped out. There's absolutely no proof of this, guys, but it would be interesting, because if he sat there and said, oh, well, Rena helped me do this, maybe that would push Rose to do it so that she could be in that top position. It was like she was vying for top position with Rena. She suspected that Fred and Rena were still carrying on, and they were still having a sexual relationship, and from time to time they did live together. So it does make sense. Maybe he was trying to push Rose, and of course in Rose's mind, she would want to one up everything Rena did. Everything Rena did, she would want to do too, and go further and do it better. So it would make sense. And Fred's a known bullshitter, guys. So it's very possible he made up whatever stories he felt like, told them to Rose. Rose believed them, or Rose just wanted to believe them. Maybe she had an active interest in murder. But it's important, I think, to note this and to, I don't want to say assume, but to think that that could have been part of the reason why Rose joined in, let's just say. I don't think that, for the record though, guys, there is no evidence at all that Rena participated in anything other than sexual things. From everything I've read and heard, that Rena might have been wild, she might have been loud, she might have been mouthy, she might have been prone to drinking, she might have been all of these things, but it doesn't seem like she was a danger to anybody but herself. Maybe the women Fred was seeing, but. So it is believed, actually, guys, that Fred killed Rena sometime in August. Yeah, you heard me. In August of 1971. They're not sure of the exact date. It's very hard to pinpoint because I don't really think that Fred himself knew. But it would appear to be sometime in August. Now, of course, the main reason for this is because Rena had come around looking for her girls, particularly Shar. She had a very close bond with Shar. And of course, Shar wasn't there. Rose and Fred had also told everybody that Shar had gone to Glasgow with Rena, particularly Anna. Anna would be Rena and Fred's daughter after Charmaine was born. So Anna believed that. There is some indications that Rena was snooping around, maybe asking a few too many questions. And so in this way, Fred decided he had to get rid of her. Rose could have also been okay with the decision, right? Because then her number one contender is out of the picture and she's got Fred all to herself. I don't know much about how Fred lured her there. There seem to be indications that it would be much like the other murders where he likely strangled them or choked them during sexual acts that involved bondage. Now, before we get too much further into this, I want to explain the BDSM angle that we're looking at. Fred and Rose practiced bondage. In fact, they practiced it the whole marriage. You could tell they had every accoutrement, all the masks, the suits, the ball gags, etc., etc., etc. Their sex life would grow harsher and harsher because Fred believed Rose wanted it that way. I don't think he ever asked her. She didn't seem to object anyway. So they practiced it, but they didn't practice it properly. In the BDSM community, guys, in order for you to practice it properly, it has to be 2 willing participants or a group of willing participants. It can't be somebody forcing somebody else to do it against their will. There has to be safe words. Everything has to be respected. Everything has to be okayed by the person that is playing the submissive. One usually tends to take a dominant role and one a submissive role. Fred and Rose didn't practice that, obviously, unless it was between the two of them. But what they forced on their victims definitely lacked consent. We already know this, guys, and there was definitely torture involved in it too. There were no safe words, nothing like that. Anyway, it is believed that Fred murdered Rena sometime in August of 1971. Like I said, I'm not sure how he lured her out there, probably under the pretense that the two of them were going to have some type of sexual escapade. At this point in time, he wants to have sex all the time, but from what I've heard, he was very short with it, let's just say. So also, if Rena was gone, this would contribute to his story with Rose, that Shar was with Rena and they just never came back, right? 2 birds, 1 stone. He's gotten rid of Rena, and this helps out his relationship with Rose too. He doesn't have to worry about a divorce, and also his their cover story, I should say, for the disappearance of Shar made more sense. Rena was never reported missing either, guys. She just never was. So he decapitated her like the others and dismembered her. He didn't always take the arms off of his victims, but with Rena he did. So her head, like I said, he liked to bury people in small, deep holes. He had enough room to bury them in an actual size grave, but he never did that. It was just a small, really deep hole. And he would put the torso inside and then stack the arms and legs on it. Or if he hadn't removed the arms, stack the legs on it and put the head inside there as well. He buried her remains in a place called Letterbox Field. So this isn't Finger Post Field. It's a different field, but still in Muchmarkle. And he said he did this because this was his and Rena's favorite place. This was like their place. It's where they used to go to make love, as he said, but where they'd also shared good times. So he buried her under the only tree that was actually in this field. She, of course, was missing a kneecap, at least one. several toe bones, several finger bones, wrist bones, ankle bones, these small bones, and no one ever knows, or ever knew, I should say, what Fred did with these bones. They've never been found, but she was missing. That was his signature, was the removal of these bones. And she was found in June of 1994. She was one of the last victims found. I want to say either Anne McFall or Shar was the last victim found, but she was one of the last three. And Fred actually told the investigators where to find these three bodies. Of course, we already know most of the other ones that we know about, were located at 25 Cromwell Street. So in August of 1971, Rose was actually pregnant again. Yeah, she has a lot of kids and she has them very fast. She was also involved heavily in sex acts, like we know, at Fred's behest with other men. And usually these men, guys, were men of color, of Jamaican descent. I'm trying to say it in the best way I can, but this was how it was written. The community they lived in at that point in time, in Gloucester, was heavily populated by people from the Caribbean and recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Jamaica. And Fred thought that these men would be endowed enough to take care of Rose, I guess, but he also thought that their sperm had superior lubricating qualities. I don't know why. He was buying into racial stereotypes because Fred is definitely a rampant racist, but it didn't bother him for Rose to have sex with these men. That's what he wanted. Fred was a voyeur and he wanted to watch. Of course, Rose was also sleeping with the landlord at this point in time too, because that way they wouldn't have to pay rent. That was the way of paying rent. Fred also believed, that if he had sex with Rose immediately after she had sex with the clients, the people he told her to, and he mixed his sperm with that of these men, it would prolong his erection, because Fred was known for prematurely ejaculating, and this was how he thought he could fix the problem. And of course, with Fred, it was never loving. There was no kissing. There was no hugging, no nice words or anything like that. It was always wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. That was the exact term people used. And it was just rough and clinical, almost emotionless. And he believed that's what Rose wanted. He never asked her, but he believed that's what she wanted. So in January of 1972, the couple actually finally got married. And Fred, on the license or on the piece of paper that would prove that they were married, said that he was a bachelor when he was filling out the forms. Of course, we know this is untrue. He was actually still technically married to the missing Rena, but at this point in time, it doesn't matter. I mean, he can't prove she's dead either, so technically he's a bigamist. I never actually thought about that. But anyway, regardless, he married Rose. And in 1972, Rose would have been about 19. Fred would have been 31. He liked younger women, but there is younger girls too. And they were married, of course, at a registry office, just like he and Rena were. His brother John and another one of his criminal associates actually served as his witnesses. John is in and out of the picture, guys. He does play an important role in it. And it was just like before. Fred arrived from work, and the two of them married in his dirty work clothes. And then after the ceremony, they went out and had one drink, and he then went back to work. That was the way he was. Fred was a hard worker. I can't say that he wasn't. So at this time, Fred started a relationship of sorts with a woman named Liz. And Liz was unlike a lot of his other conquests because he did seem to have feelings for her. An interest in her is what people said. I don't think Fred really had much feelings towards people, but he was interested in her. Of course, this was a threat to Rose. But they did invite her in at some point in time for a drink. And then she woke up the next morning naked in between the two of them. And Fred actually bragged to her about the fact that he raped her when she was unconscious. And Rose probably did too, but not much was said about that. Despite this, Liz still carried on with him for a while. The reason being that he claimed to keep this relationship up was that Fred didn't like pregnant girls. He thought that was unattractive, and at this point in time, we know Rose is pregnant, so he just didn't find her attractive, I guess, as much when she was pregnant. There is another saying. He claimed that when Rose was pregnant, she would become even more sexually aggressive and would seek out female-female relationships. Rose always denied that she was a lesbian or had lesbian tendencies. She appears to be bisexual though, but she always denied this. Their baby, May June, was born June 1st. She was supposed to be in May. She was supposed to be born in May, but she was born June 1st, so that's why her name is May June. And yes, she got made fun of a lot for it. She eventually changed the spelling of it. And hers was the only birthday out of all of his kids that Fred could ever remember. Fred wasn't a great dad. We already know this, but Fred also often forgot his children's names. He couldn't remember them all. There was a lot of them. And he couldn't remember any birthday but hers. So she was born June 1st of 1972. And by November of 72, Rose was pregnant yet again. So this is going to be Rose's third pregnancy. With help from their landlord, though, he did give them the down payment. This is Mr. Zagmont. To buy their own house. And this would be the House of Horrors, guys, 25 Cromwell Street. They were finally able to buy this house. And it was more or less midsummer of 1972 they bought the house. And then they moved in a little bit later on. Fred loved 25 Cromwell Street, guys. He was very house proud. He would often just take strangers in off the street like he used to before with the partying. He'd just take them in off the street and give them a tour of the house. He loved his house that much. He loved it as much as Rose, but it's possible he even loved it more than Rose. That was his place. He loved it. Fred loves objects, not people. So for the next 22 plus years, 25 Cromwell Street, for as long as Fred and Rose would actually live there, 25 Cromwell Street was under a constant state of construction. Whenever Fred wasn't working at work and when he wasn't partaking in other festivities, he was working on the house. There was constant chaos in the house, constant noise. It never ceased. He'd be working on it in the middle of the night because Fred had problems with sleeping. He was an insomniac, and he would just wake up and either rearrange his tools. He also had a love of his tools. You guys know these were sexual aids to him too. Or he would start building onto the house. And though Fred could be good at building and decorating, from what they say, he did have an artistic streak. He wasn't always up to par, especially within his own house. It was good, but he did cut corners on occasion. And he also didn't care about building permits, and he stole most of the equipment and most of the lumber, etc., that he used to build the add-ons, because Fred was a kleptomaniac, as we know. He added an extra room, and this was just for Rose. It would change areas too, but he did add an extra room. This was strictly for Rose. It actually had a sign outside of it that said Rose's room, and there was a separate bell for her visitors. She was known as Mandy Mouse when she was working, because after May and when they arrived at Cromwell Street, she actively became a prostitute. She started accepting clients. Only the white clients ever paid, though, guys. And I don't think she made much money at the start, because really she was giving away a lot of freebies. But at the same point in time, this was her own bell. It was her own room. It was decorated nicely, actually, kind of. There was a full bar in it. There was a tropical mural, but there were also suggestive photos of women, you know, sometimes naked, sometimes half naked. I remember the poster with with the dark-haired woman, and she was, you know, in lingerie. This is where Rose's room, they would keep pornographic equipment in. There would be framed photographs of her and her many lovers. There was also a separate bathroom at one point in time that was just for Rose that she kept these into. And they did have another room for their massive pornography, but we'll get into that later. So this is where she entertained. Oddly enough, and of course, Fred stole the materials to make the Rose's room sign. He made her a large four-poster canopy bed, and most of the decorations they took from their constant viewing of pornographic videos. And on the posters of the bed, he actually affixed bulls, images of bulls, and on the side of the bed, there were like two toys. One was a bull and one was a cow, and it looked like they were simulating sex. It appeared to be on a sideboard. I can't quite be certain of that, guys, because he always called Rose his cow. And that was just their thing. There was also a really ornate sign that was made because he also made the ornate 25 Cromwell Street sign outside, okay? He also made an ornate sign that said C-T. You guys know what I'm saying. That was also in the room. He used to call it the Black Magic Bar too. I believe the bar was called that. And of course, since he owned this house, he would drill holes in all the rooms he wanted to view. There were no locks on any of the rooms besides possibly Rose's, guys. I'm not even certain of that. You just knew not to enter Rose's room. You would knock if you needed something. There were certain rooms the kids were not allowed to enter and that they would have to knock. But as far as I know, there was no locks, particularly on the bathrooms. And Fred would drill holes into the bathrooms, Rose's room especially, sometimes the lodgers' rooms, any place where he wanted to be able to peep at them. We know he's a voyeur, so he enjoyed watching them, even more than being in the room while it happened. He also enjoyed taking pictures, recording things. He would also hide recording devices in Rose's rooms because if he couldn't view them, he wanted to be able to hear them. And how he would do this was originally with a baby monitor. So the receiving end he would have, and the monitor itself would be in Rose's room, and he could take that and wander around and listen to it. It was particularly in the kitchen at that point in time, but he would listen to it. And of course, if he could do neither, he depended on the clients, his friends, to give him a review of what had happened. Now, Rose actually had a script to follow, guys. She could never appear to enjoy it too much. And she also could only talk about certain subjects. If she strayed from this, then she had to enjoy it, but she couldn't enjoy it too much. It's really confusing. If she didn't follow these rules, or it looked like she was having too much fun, sounded like she was, she'd get a beating from Fred. He still does this. She was a willing participant. She was enthusiastic though, guys, don't get me wrong. And with Rose, she had learned quite a bit from the pornography. So it was very loud. It was very noisy. It was very embarrassing. She would scream every line she ever heard. And when I say scream, she screamed, guys. The kids always heard it. The neighbors would hear it. Everybody heard it. She'd do this when they took holidays too. They used to go on holiday once a year. This was a little bit later on, particularly to Barry Island. That's where Fred's family had actually gone on holiday to when he was a kid a lot of the times. One of their sons is named after it, actually. And the kids would talk about how when they were in the caravan, that's all you could hear were their parents doing their thing. So Fred also hated the police. You guys know that Rose did too. And because of this, they taught their kids to hate the police. At one point in time, Fred put gates around the house. Now, these gates were not so much to keep people out. They were, but they were also to keep people in, okay? Fred and Rose always wanted to be around the children. There were several reasons for this, but they wanted their children to stay indoors as much as possible. They really didn't allow them to play with that many other kids or to have relationships with other kids. This is because, A, they didn't want what was going on in the house, particularly the sexual abuse, because as the girls aged, Fred would want to grope them and look at them and things of that nature, which we'll get into in a few minutes. He didn't want anybody to find out, and neither did Rose, what was going on in the house. All of the kids, whenever they talked to somebody, one of the parents, if not both of them, had to be present. That was just the way it was. It was also Fred's way of keeping control over his environment. Fred dearly loves control. And it was his way of being allowed to know who directly was in the house. It's like another off branch of control, because that way he could control who was coming in and out. Some people knew about some of the things he did, some people didn't. And he would also tell the kids to watch out for the police because they were interlopers that were just wanting to tear the family apart. Don't talk to social services. Don't talk to the police. Don't involve them with any part of your life. They're evil people that just want to rip the family apart. That was one of their main mantras. So at first, due to the fact that they had to pay the mortgage, they started taking on lodgers. Fred did work, but they have a growing family, and now they have a mortgage above their heads. So they started to rent out the top rooms. And at first, the lodgers were strictly male, and they could be anybody. They were mostly high school dropouts, people involved in the drug trade, hippies, runaways, people that had no better place to go. But Fred also knew that if these lodgers moved in, and they were fairly young, if these lodgers moved in, he could have access to girls this way, because inevitably runaway girls would show up, or girls that these people were dating, or friends of these girls. He knew this. So the house at this point in time actually became a revolving door. Like I said, he'd invite anybody and everybody in off the street, and there you go. It would be party time. He once told the kids that his life started, I think it was May. He said his life started when they went to bed. Yeah. So there was a constant stream of people in and out of the house at this point in time. And Rose didn't like it. She actually didn't want the lodgers there, but she was always overruled by Fred. Fred had to have his way. And he became, when he wasn't at work or working on the house, he was with the lodgers, which also made Rose mad, because then he was spending very little, if any time at all, with the family. And of course, because of all these lodgers and all the free-flowing drugs, and Fred would express to the lodgers that he had a very free attitude towards sex. He would often talk to them. He would often draw out stories from them about what they liked, and et cetera, et cetera. And they would tell him things that they may not tell other people, but I believe most of them were under influences at that point in time. You know what I mean? So because of this, there were many police raids on 25 Cromwell Street, many of them throughout the years. At this point in time, though, the marriage started to become more troubled, and there were constant arguments, particularly about the lodgers. And as I said before, Fred was slower to anger than Rose. In fact, the kids often said it was Rose that they were terribly afraid of. Yes, Fred was sexually abusing the girls, and yeah, he could get mad, but he would be one that would tell Rose to stop and to let it be. The kids actually said if they had to pick between their parents, despite what Fred did, they'd rather live with him because of Rose's anger and her sadistic beatings. But Fred actually started to beat Rose at this point in time. He would hit her, particularly if she argued with him about the lodgers. During one of these attacks, Rose actually took Heather and May, she was still pregnant with Steve at this point in time, and left Fred. Not really, but she did. She went to her parents' house. She didn't take Anna Marie with her. And of course, Fred did find out she was gone. Rose was meant to stay in the house, right? She was housebound most of the time and seemed to be okay by her anyway. And he would take the kids, or he took Anna Marie to her parents' house to go and find her. And of course, Bill at this time isn't too keen on Fred, but that would change, trust me. He told Bill to tell Rose that she had 10 minutes to get in the van, or, quote, there'll be somebody else in her bed tonight, end quote. And of course, Rose acquiesced. She ended up being in the van and they went back home for all intents and purposes. However, she said that her reason for leaving wasn't necessarily because of the beatings. It was because Fred treated her like a schoolgirl. She was only, 19. And they talked about it, and he actually said, you know what? I am treating you that way. So he decided to give her more equality in the relationship. They became more equals then, and he was handing over his pay packet to her. He didn't require much, if anything at all, because he stole everything he wanted. And he wasn't known for wearing new clothes, remember, right? He would prefer to have hand-me-downs, things that he found in the garbage, things that were worn out. Things from dead people. He just preferred to do that. And of course, this is, I should say, this 1972, after this incident, was the time where she, I guess, since she wasn't going to be viewed as a schoolgirl anymore, acquiesced to being a prostitute. Sorry, guys, it was at this point in time she did acquiesce and actively became a prostitute. And she took the name Mandy Mouse, which is interesting because Rena used to use the name Mandy as well. So shortly after they moved in, Fred and Rose, like I said before, this was probably a little bit after the leaving. Can't quite recall though, guys. Made up with her parents in a way. Somehow they got them to come and visit, and it did look like Rose was living an okay life. She seemed to be happy with Fred at that point, or that was what was showing. So they decided, Bill particularly decided to make it up with Fred and Rose. At one point in time, he told his daughter she was out of the house, out of the family, and that if he saw her, he'd knife her in the street. And we know that Bill is not, he's crazy. He's not a great person. He's extremely violent. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He probably was suffering from PTSD. Very violent man, and he sexually abused Rose. I told you in the last video it went on, and it did, because Bill became like one of Rose's clients too, except he didn't have to pay. He did come there for sexual intercourse with his daughter. This continued for many years. But he got along better with Fred at this point in time. Daisy still had her reservations though. She never wanted to be alone with Fred. She would never accept a ride from Fred. She didn't speak to him. And the reason being is because she never liked the reason she was given for why Charmaine disappeared. Daisy Letts actually liked Charmaine. She thought she was a lovely, nice little girl. And one day she went to go visit Rose, and Char was there. The next time she came to visit, Char was gone. And she never liked the reason that Fred and Rose gave her. She always suspected something more, and she was right to. But she never liked it. So that was another reason why she didn't have much to do with Fred. So at this point in time, Rose also stopped wearing underwear at Fred's behest. And she would always wear skirts, guys. And no bra either. This was a huge source of embarrassment for the kids as they were growing up, because Rose would sit with her legs open, and if they'd say something to her, she'd say, well, if you don't effing like it, then don't effing look. Eventually, she stopped wearing underwear out in public too, but this was one of her things. She did that for Fred, and Fred would come home, oh God, and he was so dirty and everything. And he would grope her in front of the kids, you know what I mean by groping, underneath. And then he would smell his own hands or force the children to smell his hands and say, do you smell that? That's what your mother smells like. In October of 1972, a lovely girl named Caroline Owens, her original last name was Rain, you may recognize her as Owens, came to work for Fred and Rose. They met her while she was hitchhiking on the way back from visiting her boyfriend Tony, and persuaded her to come and work as a nanny for them. And she initially agreed because she didn't like her stepfather. Caroline didn't have that great of life either. Her dad was in the picture for a bit, then he wasn't, you know, like most of the others. She came from a vulnerable home. Fred could sense this. He sensed it in Rose. He sensed it in Rena. He sensed it in Anne. He could sense it. And of course, these were the people he figured he could manipulate the most. So Caroline came and stayed with them. And she did, she thought life was going to be better than for her there. She thought she was going to have her own room, but she actually shared a room at this point in time with Anna Marie. And she did notice that Anna Marie was withdrawn. We'll get into that in a second. There are reasons for it. But regardless, she was persuaded to stay there. And at first it was okay. Her mom and stepfather actually came to visit, and they noted that what a nice normal couple Fred and Rose looked like. And Rose was only a couple years older than Caroline anyway. So she thought that they could be friends or whatever. She was quite taken with the girls at this point in time anyway, so she was willing to help out. She came from a big family. There were a lot of brothers and sisters. She had an older stepbrother who bullied her quite a bit, guys. And her stepfather was very cold and hard. Her mother seems like she was a nice woman, but she, of course, she had a hard time too throughout life, let's just say. Now, she did do some work as a model when she was a kid, and she thought she could, magazine modeling, things of that nature. And she thought she could make a career out of that. But a lot of what she did turn out to be later on involving taking off her clothes and becoming something like the Sunshine Girls they used to have in like the Toronto, was it Toronto Sun that used to have them in, where they were kind of like softcore porn, almost suggestive posing, things like that. She did end up doing that. A couple of the places where she lived at, she was attacked by some of the men there, and she figured it was just better to let them do what they did and get it over with than putting up a fight and possibly getting hurt. And this had a psychological effect on her. She ended up having many partners. It was almost like with Rose, she equated sex with love, but not completely. So at first, this was a great thing for Caroline Owens. You know, she was going to get paid for this. She was looking she was looking after kids as a nanny, had Rose for friendship. Didn't have to live with her stepfather. At first, this was ideal. But as the weeks went by, and she was only there for about 6 weeks, guys. As the weeks went by, she noticed changes. First of all, Fred started talking about sex constantly. We know he does this, right? He grooms you for like a day or two, and then he starts laying it all out. And he would tell her things like he knew how to do abortions. He didn't. And could perform that if she wanted it. And then he started like kind of pressuring her into having a relationship with him. According to Fred, these relationships were all consensual. He built it up in his mind like that, even though they weren't. And she was warned by a couple other people that Rose had a tendency for bisexuality, and that Rose might try to try it on with her. Those were the actual words that they used. She was particularly creeped out because Fred told her that 8-year-old Anna, was no longer a virgin. You heard me, 8-year-old Anna. Since the time she turned 8, Fred and Rose both of them had been violently raping her downstairs in the basement. They would tie her up and use horrible instruments on her tiny little 8-year-old body. Her own father would rape her. Rose would sadistically abuse her sexually and rape her with vibrators. Fred even made this apparatus that she had to wear around, and it almost looked like a chastity belt of sorts, guys. I don't think it was made of like heavy metal up here. It was almost like an elasticized waist or like a belt. And then this egg shaped, she remembers it distinctly as looking as it like an egg cup made out of steel, in which a vibrator was put in. And then she would be forced to wear this inside of herself and walk around the house doing her chores, etc., in a mini skirt wearing this device. She was forced to do this. He told he told Caroline this in order to gauge her response. And of course she was horrified. So he quickly said, oh, she accidentally got on her bike and didn't realize that the seat had been stripped from it and she damaged herself down there. That's what I meant. She was very shocked at what she was hearing. And like I said, after about 6 weeks, she decided this wasn't for her. She had been propositioned at this point in time by both Fred and Rose, and she was just very uncomfortable being there. So she left. Oddly enough, she doesn't remember this, but apparently the person that took her from the house originally, the one that gave her a ride back to her parents' house, said that he found her crying and saying something about there being a sex ring at Fred and Rose's house. She didn't remember this for quite some time afterward, but she spoke to the man and the man told her absolutely that it was true. She also reported Anna's abuse to authorities, but nothing was done with it, about it. But at this point in time, she decided to leave. So she left in mid-November. Now, of course, she was known to hitchhike to her boyfriend's, Tony's house. And Fred and Rose knew this, guys. They knew it. They knew where she'd be. So on December 6th of 1972, Caroline went and visited her boyfriend, and on the way back, a familiar vehicle pulled up to her. It was Fred and Rose. They claimed to want to apologize. They said they were sorry, that they made, her feel uncomfortable, things of that nature. And they said, we'll give you a ride home. She was wary of them, but she didn't necessarily want to walk the distance alone in the dark. And she may have believed them to some extent. Regardless, she ended up getting in the vehicle. And Rose got into the back so they could have some girl talk, ostensibly. And then Rose started to aggressively feel her up and things of that nature. And Fred and Rose ended up stopping at a field. She was punched several times in the head, enough that she blacked out. She was then bound, her hands and feet, and they made this mask for her. You're going to hear more about it. I'm going to call it a mask. It was also a gag of sorts. It wasn't a full facial one at this point. It would be around this area right here, so you could still breathe. And it was made of very heavy packing tape. And when I say mask, it was actually wound around your head all the way, several layers. And they put this on her and they managed to get her into the house in Cromwell. So the couple brought her home. And of course, as you can guess, she was subjected to numerous assaults by both Fred and Rose. They cut the mask off of her and stuffed her mouth with cotton balls. And of course they untied her, forced her to undress, and then retied her back up. So she was bound throughout this point in time. They did many things to her, including whipping her private area with a belt, but not with like the leather end. And this is like a heavy leather belt. The kids remember this belt too. Rose would always wear a really heavy leather belt, but with the buckle end. They beat her there. They hit her. Rose was known for biting, scratching, specifically scratching and twisting, I should say. And being as harsh as she possibly could. Whenever she was with a woman, she was very, very aggressive, and she was always trying to push that woman further and further and further, break their boundaries, and break them, actually. And she would say, what, aren't you woman enough to take it? Things of that nature. So Rose was very much an aggressor in this. At some point, she even had to sleep between the two of them, and they would break up these weird, this torture and abuse. They would break it up so they could go and have cups of tea. They would bring up cups of tea. Just, that's mind-blowing in itself. This act of domesticity coupled with what they were doing. Anyway. So at one point in time, during the early morning, she was forced to sleep with her tormentors, trussed up. There was a knock on the door, And she thought, oh my God, this is my chance. So she started screaming and like yelling out. Fred went to go see the visitor, and Rose actually suffocated her with a pillow, was putting a pillow over her face with pressure on it. Of course, Fred came back. He got rid of the visitor. Fred came back. He was angry. He was yelling. His face had contorted at this point in time. So she was seeing angry Fred. And he told her that he would kill her for that. Like, I'm going to kill you if you do that. I can't believe you do that. Things of that nature. So, of course, they were molesting her again. And Rose then had to go and, I shouldn't say molesting her. They were raping her. Rose had to go and see to the children at this point in time and probably make sure Anna got to school. Sorry, I've watched a lot of Frozen, guys, so I might accidentally refer to her as Anna. Had to go to school. So Fred raped Caroline on his own. And at that point, he started to cry, you guys. And he said he was sorry. She was supposed to be there for his and Rose's pleasure. Although in one account it said that she was just supposed to be there for Rose's pleasure, but regardless, that he was sorry. Please don't tell Rose that he raped her by himself. He agreed not to kill her if she would agree to come back and look after the family or the kids again. He said actually, quote, when Rose gets pregnant, her lesbian urges get stronger and she has to have a woman and she really wanted you, end quote. He said it would make Rose happy if Caroline decided to be a nanny again. Sensing that this was her way out, she agreed. And she actually was untied, allowed to bathe and dress and go downstairs and help out with the rest of the kids. She pretended to normalize things as much as possible. At one point in time, as far as I know, guys, now there were 2 stories given about this, but at one point in time, the family had to take their clothing to a laundromat. And she told Rose that she needed to go out for a pack of cigarettes, and Rose agreed, thinking that she was okay with everything, and that's how she escaped them. Another one of the stories just said that she told Rose she had to go out for cigarettes, and that's how she escaped them. But regardless, Caroline Owens, aside from Anna, is the only real survivor of Fred and Rose. There would be one more, but I don't know if they ever thought of doing what they had done to Caroline, to this girl. We'll get into it, guys. We'll get into it. So eventually Caroline was able to get out. Now, she went home and her mother saw that she was in a state. And she looked at her daughter's body and saw all of these wounds. And so, of course, police were called about it. As such, Fred and Rose were arrested. There were, according to some of the doctors, though, according to the doctors or according to some reports, they couldn't find evidence of rape, which strikes me as odd because obviously her area had been quite beaten. But I'm not sure how long it was exactly before things were reported. Regardless, they were reported. It appears definitely that when she was questioned about things by police that they didn't believe her, and it almost seemed like they were suggesting that it was her fault. Anyway, this is 1972, guys, so, you know, women weren't believed as much. They were very aggressive towards her, the police, and were trying to make it seem like she wanted it. But Fred and Rose were actually arrested, and they did plead guilty to indecent assault and actual bodily harm in this case, so that the rape charge was dropped. And they were fined a total of 100 pounds, sorry guys, which is about 174.44 Canadian. And they were told actually to seek mental health help. It appeared in the papers. The article did appear, an article about this did appear in the papers, and Rose cut it out and kept it. She would do this with things, that they had their own scrapbook of horrors. Caroline Owens was, of course, their first attempt together to kidnap and torture and kill a woman. Now, according to Fred, he had meant to kidnap and probably murder Caroline Owens, but he also wanted to see if Rose would go along with it. And of course she did. This fact that they were only fined and never thrown in jail, and that they were able to get the rape charge itself excused probably led them to feeling even more invincible and into thinking there were no consequences for what they did. But this attack also gave them the ability to refine what they did later on and to not have someone be able to escape. Let's just say they learned from their mistakes. So Fred had made the cellar into a place to live. He divided it into 3 rooms. One room was for his his tools. One room was for a children's playroom, actually. And then there was this like middle section, which had the steps that led down to it. And at this point in time, it wasn't used really for anything. However, it would be a good place to take victims to. So they may have used that area. I know they used the cellars. So they may have used that particular area for it. The kids recall eye hooks being affixed into the beams above. And they used to attach swings to it because that's what they thought it was for. But in reality, these hooks were actually for suspending somebody. This is why I said to you guys to remember the Robin Holt suicide, because Robin Holt was hanging from his neck, half undressed with pornographic pictures spread out beneath him. I'm just saying, the hanging part, the pornography, it just almost leads me to believe that Fred killed this kid. But nevertheless, we can't be certain. So Linda Gough, G-O-U-G-H, visited Cromwell Street because she actually became friendly with one of the lodgers there. She was different from most of the others guys in that she actually lived with both of her parents in, I think she lived, I always want to say Glasgow. She lived in that area, Gloucester, with both of her parents. They were still together. Her dad was actually a fireman, and her mom worked too. She was about 19 years old, and she worked as a seamstress for a local company. So she had a job. She hadn't done very well in school. It appears that she actually had a learning disability, and she wore glasses like the kind that John Lennon would wear, and she also had really long, dark, beautiful hair. Like I said, she didn't do particularly well in school, but she didn't graduate with any GSCEs. I'm not quite sure what those are, but it would appear that those are almost like back in the day when we had the OAC year, grade 13, it doesn't exist anymore now. That would help you to get into university. Maybe Linda could have went to college. I'm not totally sure about that, but regardless, she was working as a seamstress at this point in time, and she became acquainted with one of the lodgers at 25 Cromwell Street, and that's how she ended up going over there originally. In mid-April of 1973, Linda Gough left a note for her parents saying that she had a new apartment and that she'd come to visit them when she could, and telling them not to worry. About 10 days later, by the 29th, when her parents hadn't heard from her or seen from her, they started to get suspicious, and they started to look around for her. So Linda Gough actually was reported missing, and they started to look around for her. Her boss was the one that actually told them that she was at 25 Cromwell Street, or that she had gone there. She had been going there. And they went there to check up. Her mother particularly, I think her father was at work at this point in time, went there to go check and see if their daughter was there. Fred and Rose both answered the door and said they'd never heard of Linda Gough. They had no idea who she was, and she wasn't there. Rose was actually wearing the same slippers that Linda was wearing when she left home. And Rose was also wearing, they described it as either a cardigan or a blouse that belonged to Linda too. And there were articles of clothing out on the clothing line that had belonged to Linda. Her mother definitely recognized them. Rose, of course, they just said it was coincidence. No, she'd never heard of her, never been there, nothing like that. At Rose's own trial later on, she would say that Linda had been at the house for a little bit and then decided to move to another area, but never told them where. So she was reported missing, but nothing, of course, came of her being reported missing until March of 1994, when Linda's remains, dismembered, beheaded, missing various bones, were found underneath an add-on bathroom that Fred had been constructing at the time that she had gone missing. They used to call this second bathroom Fred's office. So while he sat on the toilet doing his business, he would call the children or Rose or anybody to come in and talk to him. So they'd sit on the edge of the tub. Fred would be on the toilet, and in between them would actually be the body of Linda Go, buried underneath the concrete. The kids never had any idea about this either. Like, unbelievable, but it gets worse. So like I said, she had been decapitated and her legs had been removed at the hips. It doesn't appear like her arms were removed. She was missing her kneecaps, both of them, and bones from her wrists, toes, and fingers, like many of the others. In fact, I think they said they only found about 72 of her actual bones. No clothing scraps were ever found with her body, like many of the others, but a portion of string, a fragment of packing tape mask, like wound around her lower face. A fragment of material, and the packing tape gag, the packing tape mask, was found as well. As with all the others, and I want you guys to remember this, no definitive cause of death could ever be found. Number one, they were missing bones. But number two, when their remains were found, in a lot of the cases, it was 20 plus years later, so they were basically skeletonized by that time. They couldn't find a lot of absolute proof about what had happened, and how directly they died. They felt that most of these women were either strangled or suffocated. Another interesting side note is that they would find piles of fingernails beside these bodies. I don't know if it was every body, but I know they did find it in some cases, and it would appear, and Fred actually talked about this too, it would appear that as part of the torture, he pulled their fingernails out while they were still alive. So the Wests had their third child together, and this was Stephen with a PH, not with a V, like Fred's son from a 1959 affair with a woman. Okay, Stephen. And it appears he was named after his father's middle name. He was born in August of 1973, and Fred was delighted. He was delighted to have a son. So they appeared to be happy at that point. In the summer of 1974, Fred had started to work at the Gloucester Wagon Works, and he actually stayed there for quite some time, guys. I think he was there for 10 plus years. He was still doing odd jobs for the landlord, though, too, so he was still working all the time. His workmates thought of him as a good man. Maybe slightly odd. He had a slight lisp, and he was very likable, though, and they knew he was a bullshitter. He'd often invite them around his house to either have sex with Rose or to view his blue movies, because that was another thing he liked to show people, was his pornographic movies. And they remember that very well. It was also in the summer of 1973 that Fred's abandoned son, Stephen with a V, came to stay with them. His mother had actually had a breakdown at this point, a mental breakdown. She'd never asked for anything from Fred before, and she loved her son a lot. So she didn't want him to have to deal with that when she was in her hospital stay. So she called up Fred and Rose and said, "Will you take him?" And Fred agreed. Rose was more of the school of thought that if this is your son, Fred, then I guess, but you know. Rose was very violent towards Stephen. She didn't molest him. I don't think anybody molested him that I know of, but he and Anna, of course, were close in age, so they got along quite well. and closer in age, I should say. They got along quite well. And Fred and Rose didn't want this. They didn't want their kids to communicate with each other without them around because one might say something to the other. He remembers getting violently beaten by Rose. It was mostly Anna and Rose at this time that took the beatings. So punching, slapping, kicking. She at one point in time kicked him with a stiletto on, and it punctured this area right here. It was also during this point in time in 1973. So May herself would have been very young. She was born in 72. So she was little more than a baby. Just give me 1 second. I'm sorry, guys. I have so many kids that it's very hard to remember. Oh my God, I'm so sorry, guys. She was born June 1st of 1972. So at this point in time, she's a little over a year old. But the kids did remember that later on, when she was still pretty small, but probably a toddler, so it may have been a little bit after this, Rose actually took a knife because she was angry with May for something. Nobody ever understood what would set her off. Nothing could set her off. She actually took a knife and slashed at her rib cage. She was only wearing like an undershirt and some undies at this point in time. She slashed her rib cage repeatedly while May screamed to stop. Rose didn't care. You made her mad, you took it. So eventually in 1974, Stephen actually was able to go home. There's a specific reason behind this. His mother got better and she was like, okay, I'm okay now. Please send my son home. She wanted him back home with her. Fred and Rose couldn't let this happen. If they sent Stephen to her, Stephen could tell about everything going on in the house. And then Fred would not have control, A, over him, but also over his mouth. So they actually tried to keep him, but his mother was a smart lady and she involved the authorities. And because of this, they grudgingly gave him back because of the authorities were involved. Then Anna or one of the younger kids, Heather or May, could be able to say something at this point in time. So they reluctantly relinquished him to his mother. On November 10th of 1973, 15-year-old Carol Kaz Cooper disappeared. So she had been living in a children's home, and like most of the others, since the age of 13, actually, she'd been living there. And like most of the others, she came from not a very good home life. She was supposed to that night be going to stay overnight at her grandmother's house. This was actually the first time that the children's home was letting her do this, and she was excited. She was at this point in time friends with some bikers. That could be how she ended up knowing Fred and Rose. I'm not particular on that. I don't think anybody really knows. And she was very tall and strong, and she had nicknamed herself Kaz. She actually had tattooed it on her forearm. Her parents, of course, like most of the others, weren't together, and she had grown fairly rebellious. So she was given to shoplifting at that point in time and to running away. So it was decided that for her own good, she should be placed in this children's home. Of course, she ran away from there a couple times too. But at this point in time, she was going to be able to go and stay overnight at her grandmother's house. It seems like she must have been close to her grandmother. She had gone to a movie with her boyfriend on that night. And they'd had a small tiff, but her boyfriend and her had made it up. He remembers taking her to the bus stop, and he thought she got on the bus. This was at 9:15. He then left, p.m. He then left and went home, but no one ever saw her again after that. On March 8th of 1994, Carol's body was actually found under the basement floor in the part of the basement that eventually became Stephen's room. Yeah, the kids actually, when they were relegated to the basement, were forced to sleep on these bodies. They had no idea. I just can't imagine the psychological damage that would have done to them when they found out. but regardless, that's where she was found. A lot of the bodies were actually found in the cellar. Apparently they formed a rough circle from what I've been able to gather, guys. And a lot of these eventually became the kids' rooms. Definitely Heather's, definitely May's, definitely Stephen's. They remember this well. As with the others, her head was removed and her legs. She was missing finger bones and toe bones and wrist bones, as well as there being no suggestion of any clothing being there. And Carol was 15 years old, guys. I just want you to remember that. Once again, she was housed in a very small, deep grave. A bit of a gag was made for her as well. That was found, but this was not made out of packing tape, guys. This was made out of surgical, elastic surgical tape. See, I almost thought that it was kind of like those tensor bandages you could wrap around yourself. From the description, I might not be certain, but this tape was stretchier, let's just say. And it was wound most likely around her lower jaw and head, as well as some cord that had likely been used to bind her with. They were also found in the grave, but no articles of clothing. 6 weeks after killing Carol, in late December of 1973, just after Christmas, 21-year-old Lucy Parrington disappeared. Now, she was actually a university student. She was studying medieval history and English, I believe. Though her parents were divorced, they were actually quite successful, you guys. So Lucy came from a more affluent upbringing than the other victims, and she didn't have as many problems. Even though her parents were divorced, it didn't seem like it was an acrimonious divorce, so she really didn't have problems like that. She was, like I said, she was studying medieval history and English at the university, and she was in her 3rd year at this point in time. And this was the University of Exeter that she was studying at. She wore glasses similar to Linda, and she also had long, dark hair. On December 27th, Lucy visited one of her friends, and a man would remember seeing Lucy running later on at night to get to the bus station, or to get to the bus stop. It would appear that she was running late. He was able to describe her clothing and everything, so it was definitely Lucy he saw running. After that, she disappeared. Of course, Lucy was reported missing, but nothing ever came of those missing reports, right? She would never have accepted a ride from a stranger. Everybody concedes to that, even if the stranger, had a wife with him. At that point in time, people were conditioned to think that the people that were going to attack you would be a lone male. So a man with a wife, or a man with a woman with him, or even a man and a woman and their baby with them, would goad people, I should say, into thinking that they were more safe. But I want to call her Linda. Lucy wouldn't have voluntarily did this. She was, how should we best describe her? She was very particular with how she got around, let's just say. Like, she wasn't really known to hitchhike. It seemed like she was more into taking the buses. But regardless, there is a possibility that she may have known Fred from when she was younger, and he delivered bread. So he may have delivered bread to her house. They can remember things of that nature, so it's possible that they encountered each other at some point in time. They were Gloucester. I mean, he worked there. So it's possible that he had known her and known about her, and in that way she remembered seeing Fred, and it could be that she accepted a ride from him because she knew him from around town. Regardless, of course, we also know that this isn't the first time that a man and woman have posed as a nice couple and lured people in. Paul and Carla did this, but so did Janice and Cameron Hooker. If you guys have ever heard the name Colleen Stan, she was the girl in the box for 7 years. That's how they did it. She was wary of Cameron, but because he had his wife with him and their newborn baby, their young baby, I should say, their infant daughter, she thought it was safe. That was a ruse. Regardless, on March 6th, 1994, Lucy's remains were found at 25 Cromwell Street. Fred claims that he'd been carrying on a sexual relationship with Lucy for a little while and that she'd voluntarily had sex with him. This is what Fred does. He doesn't see what he did as rape. He sees it as having some type of relationship with these women, and that all these women wanted Fred, so that he was just giving her what she wanted. This isn't what happened. There's no way Lucy Partington would have ever gone out with Fred. Everybody knows this. She would never have had sex with him. But regardless, that's what he claims. So, of course, she was decapitated and dismembered. Some of her toe bones and finger bones were missing. Pieces of rope and cord were found in her grave, as well as the tape gag. I guess I went back to that. It worked better. A knife, and this is the only time this happened, was also found in her grave. This was about 8 inches long, and this would seemingly be the murder weapon. Sorry, not murder weapon, because I believe she was suffocated. This would seemingly be the weapon he used to cut her apart. Oddly enough, Fred did show up with a cut to his right hand, to the ER, to casualty, on January 3rd of 1994. He most likely cut it during the dismemberment of Lucy, but this would add to the story. It would seem, because of this, remember, she went missing on December 27th. It was January 3rd when he showed up with this. So this would seem to indicate that they kept Lucy alive for some length of time, for a few days anyway, before getting rid of her. This is something that it's thought that they did to some of their other victims to keep them alive for several days, kind of like Paul and Carla. Many of the victims were also found with the fingernails, and she would be one of them too. So regardless, no clothing remains were ever found with her body either, suggesting that she was naked. She was also missing a kneecap, and oddly enough, one of her shoulder blades was also missing. That's a bigger bone, guys. It would take some talent to remove it, and obviously because Fred had been acquainted with butchering animals since childhood, he would have some rudimentary knowledge about it. So Therese, I hope I'm saying this right, Segenthaler was the next girl to go missing, and this would be over Easter of 1974. She was a 21-year-old student, once again, studying sociology, and she was originally from Switzerland. She lived actually in London's West End, guys. And she headed out in April of 1974 to hitchhike a ride to a ferry so that she could take the ferry to Ireland and visit a friend of hers. So she was hitchhiking to the ferry, and then she would take the ferry to Ireland. She was only supposed to be gone for about a week. And she was, of course, never seen alive again. She was also reported missing. However, her parents, as far as I know, still lived in Switzerland. I don't know too much about Therese. He used to call her the Dutch one, even though she was clearly from Switzerland. That's what Fred called her, or the Tulip Girl. He didn't actually ever call them by their names, just by descriptive features of them. Her body was found close to Lucy's in the cellar under the basement floor. She was missing finger, toe, wrist, and ankle bones. She'd been decapitated and dismembered. And of course, she'd been subjected to a gag made from her own scarf, you guys. He did this with her own scarf. And it was tied very tightly in a bow. Probably not something Fred would do. This would suggest that Rose was very much involved. More a ladylike touch, let's just say. This had been tied so tightly, actually, this scarf, scarf gag, that it couldn't be untied. It was tied that tightly. No evidence of clothing, once again, was found with her. So Shirley Hubbard, yeah, that's right, 15, was the next to go missing. They killed a lot in 72 and 73, guys. She was, once again, from a broken home. She had spent time in foster care. Her original actual last name had been Lloyd. One of the foster families she lived with, I believe it was the last one, she liked a lot, so she ended up taking on their last name. She did run away a couple of times. And but she was in high school, finishing it up before the GCSEs. I'm not quite sure how the system works there, guys. She was finishing it up in November of 1974. So 72, 73, 74, they took a lot of lives. She was working at a co-op job at this point in time, for the school, at a makeup counter in Debenhams. So she and her boyfriend spent the afternoon of November 14th together, and by 8:30 p.m. She was supposed to be taking her bus, or she was supposed to be on board the bus. He, once again, like Carol's boyfriend, thought that she had gotten on it, but it appears that isn't the case. There is evidence that she had actually packed a bag with a few days worth of clothing. So it appears that she, and some other articles she'd need. So it appears that she was going to be not going home that night anyway, but no one can be certain of where she was supposed to be going. However, it occurred, it doesn't really matter. She ended up at 25 Cromwell Street, of course, like many of the others, and her pitiful remains were found March 5th of 1994. She had been beheaded. Her limbs, her legs were twisted up at the thighs. I don't know if they were fully removed, but they were definitely twisted up and dislocated. She had missing finger and toe bones, and her head had been fully encased. And yeah, Lola's here. Her head had been fully encased in this packing tape mask, hood mask, they called it, like fully encased, you guys. All that she had to breathe through were two small, like, nose holes with actual length of tubing, which were found. They were found in her grave, shoved up into those nostril holes. So we're talking full on hardcore S&M. And that mask was found with her. Yeah, sorry. Just give me 1 second, guys. Woo. So by this time, Fred had quite the pornographic collection. Of course, we know this, many of which starred Rose. Many of which starred Rose by herself, not necessarily with a partner, but were videos of Rose taking bigger and bigger and bigger things into herself. That was the thing. He often told his co-workers, like we always said, that Rose was willing to sort them out whenever they needed to, and he often invited them over to view these videos. He had no qualms about that. Or the pictures, the sexually suggestive pictures he took of Rose, or her body parts, or any of the other body parts that he had photographed. He had no problems with showing, and they had no problems with looking. On Sundays, actually, he would have viewing parties for these blue movies in the cellar. And another thing with Fred and his porn collection was that the kids remember from childhood, it wasn't that they necessarily watched cartoons. Fred would watch the news, but maybe a couple other shows, but they distinctly remember watching pornographic movies. It was on, it was something they were supposed to watch. It was almost normal to them. Juanita Mott, 18, was the next to disappear. This would be in April, sorry guys, of 1975. So like most of the others, her parents weren't together. Her dad was an army man from Texas and had eventually moved back to Texas. So he had abandoned the family, and it was her mother that was looking after her and her sister Belinda. At 15, she was small, but she had very long dark hair. She was very pretty, but she had a difficult time at home, and because of this, she actually ended up in foster care. She seems to be very rebellious, and it was like her mother couldn't handle her. At 15, she left home, and by 16, she was pregnant, but it was an ectopic pregnancy, so she lost the baby. She liked adventure, and she was described as a bit of a wild child. She just liked new things and trying new things. She was friends with a former lodger at 25 Cromwell Street, and she actually moved into number 4 Cromwell Street and was a regular at the bars that Rose would go to at Fred's behest to pick up men, guys. She was also a regular at the cafe that Mary Bastholm had disappeared from too, and I should say had worked at. She dated one of the lodgers at 25 Cromwell Street. So she was friends with some of them, but she also dated one of them. And she may have possibly lived there herself for a short period of time. On April 11th, 1975, Juanita left a friend's home to hitchhike into Gloucester proper. She disappeared without a trace, and of course was not found until May 6th of 1994. She was buried once again under the cellar floor at 25 Cromwell. She was decapitated. Her legs were fully moved. She had been tied and gagged with her own clothing. So yes, they found articles of clothing, but these were used as ties and a gag. These ties were made from 2 pairs of tights, the victim's own bra, and white nylon socks that were wrapped around her skull, but also under her skull, and then tied with a bow at the top so that she couldn't move her jaw, basically speaking. 2 lengths of plastic rope were used to tie her arms and legs, and her skull actually had fractures in it, guys. You could see fractures in it, which authorities believed were from a hammer. So her body shows a possible cause of death, more so than the other victims. Both of her kneecaps were missing, as well as finger, toe, wrist, ankle bones. When the basement was full of bodies, like I said before, Fred cemented it over. Before it was cemented, it was actually a brick floor. This served Fred well, because the bricks were like floating bricks, guys. They weren't necessarily anchored in. Fred could just remove the bricks, dig underneath of it, and then replace the bricks. So it was kind of like an uneven floor, but it didn't matter. It was the perfect way for him to hide his bodies. But after the cellar was full, he actually cemented over it. And that was when it became more or less full-time the kids' bedroom for a little while. I'm just going to see, guys, if I can bring up a couple more pictures. Sorry guys, I'm just trying to get the better ones so that it's not all just 20, tiny little pictures, not 20, I should say. So that it's not all just small pictures. I don't know if this is going to come up, so hold on for a second. I'm gonna hold it as close as I possibly can. Those are the victims, guys. You can see them. Those are the 8 victims without Charmaine and Anne McFall. That's why I showed you those 2 other pictures. So at this point, guys, we're going to stop talking about bodies for a couple minutes and we're going to talk about the kid's life. Like I said before, right? Inside 25 Cromwell Street was written by May and Stephen shortly after the murders. Most of my research actually came from Happy Like Murderers and a few articles from the BBC and other news outlets from Britain. Little bit came from this book. This is a newer book, and this was written by May. So basically what we have is mostly what May and Stephen remember, as well as Anna. So as you're well aware, Fred and Rose were abusing the kids. Fred would sexually abuse the girls. As they got older, like I said, he would keep track of their periods, so he would know when they were, he had a notebook where he kept track of that. And when they were on their periods, they couldn't do things like go running, swimming, jumping, anything like that. That wasn't allowed. I don't know. He just said that wasn't allowed. And like I already told you guys before, Fred had made that odd chastity belt for Anna. And she was sexually abused by both him and Rose. Sometimes Rose initiated it. Sometimes it was Fred. Later on, he would also take her out in his work van and rape her by himself there. He had like a little light in the work van. And when it went on, she would know what to expect. He said it was a father's right to do this to his daughter. He said that it was a father's responsibility to break his daughter in and make her into a better wife that way, so she'd be able to keep a husband. And he also felt, oh, sorry guys, Lola's all up here. He also felt that a daughter should bear her father's first child. So Rose was the one to discipline the children. And I am air quoting it because I'm sorry. This was not discipline. This was sadistic beatings. Every one of the children, particularly Anna, and I believe the reason being that she abused Anna and Stephen actually too. I think one of the particular reasons why she did this so much was because Anna wasn't her child. That's also why she sexually abused Anna. It doesn't appear like she sexually abused any of the other daughters. That was strictly Fred. She never stopped the sexual abuse of her own daughter. She said, you know, well, what were you expecting? You must have been asking for it. Or she would give them a line that it was a father's right. She never stopped that. There was maybe one incident where she touched Stephen, but she didn't seem to like him for some reason. I don't know why. And we know she doesn't like Anna, and it's more than likely because that's Rena's child, not her real child. She seemed almost in a way jealous of her, particularly because Fred was using her, and Anna was never supposed to tell Rose about the work van rapes either. So, like I said, she beat them savagely and for no reason at all with whatever she could get her hands on. A shoe, a bowl, the knife she used on May, anything and everything. And she'd do it for no reason. She particularly liked to kick people, but she would slap, she would punch, she would hit you with a belt, she would beat you. She'd always make you be naked to do this so that it's even more humiliating. And when she beat you with a belt, it wasn't the leather end of the belt, it was the buckle end, much like what they had done to Caroline Owens. Like we said before, Fred did not snap out as much at the children. It was rare for him to discipline them. In fact, some of them said that he could be very kind and that he was very funny. When he wasn't abusing them, he would stand up for them with Rose and tell her that she'd gone far enough. And when he wasn't abusing them, he was kind. He was funny. He showed them how to do things. May has a love of decorating because her father showed her how. They all said that they'd rather, or some of them said, I should say some of them said they'd rather live with Fred than Rose because Rose was violent and everybody was terrified of her. However, they do remember that when she wasn't being sadistic like that, she was a pretty good mom. As they grew older, things eased off to some respect and they could joke around a little with their parents, but not completely. So Just give me 1 second, guys. Can you get me a drink? Thank you. Sorry, guys. My throat is dry. One of my kids just got home from school, so. But Fred could get violent. It was rare, but Fred could get violent with the kids. He more saved that violence for killing people. Thank you. So, by the time the girls reached adolescence or their periodhood, Fred was definitely already raping Heather. He was groping and feeling May up, and he would sexually abuse one of the other daughters, Louise, too. But May doesn't really have a recollection of him raping her. She remembers being raped by his brother, John, and another man, actually, too, when she was about 5 years old. She does remember that, but she doesn't specifically remember Fred full-on raping her. It's hard to say, though, because Steve says, yes, he does definitely remember, because, I mean, they all shared the basement, so he would have seen and heard Fred doing that to May. So maybe May has blocked it. I'm not sure. But she does remember, of course, that he would barge in on them in the bathroom whenever he felt like it. He'd spy on them. He'd come into they'd like sleep with, they'd go to bed with a bunch of layers of clothes on, and then when their dad had gone to bed, take those off, and then, but he would come in the morning and rip them off and try to get on top of them and things like that. They do remember that. Now, in the end, Rose had 7 children of her own. So there's Anna. Oh, there was Shard too, right? And older Stephen. Those were Fred's kids. But there was Heather, May, Stephen, Louise, and Barry. Those are all the kids she had with Fred West. She also had 3 kids with one of her clients, at least one of her clients, maybe 2. They're not totally sure about these. And these are biracial children. So that would be Tara, Rosemary Jr., and Luciana. I guess Fred was okay to them. I mean, he didn't really pay much attention to the kids, let's just say, but he wasn't much of a father, but he acknowledged them at least. He couldn't remember their names, but he acknowledged them, and he did give them the last name West. They were known as his and Rose's love children, because Fred had another peculiarity, I should say, where he thought that if the same man sired numerous children with the same woman, some of them would end up being mentally or physically impaired in some way. I don't know why he thought this, but he thought this. So in that way, it was okay for Rose to have children with other clients. They had to be clients. They had to be of men, Fred's choosing, because then there would be no implications, I guess, in his mind. He's got some crazy ideals, but that's what I gathered from that. He didn't actually do anything to the 3 youngest, for sure. I shouldn't say 3 youngest, because Tara was born after Louise, and then Barry was born, and then the other 3, or the other 2. But Tara, Luciana, and Rosemary Jr. were never subjected to sexual abuse by Fred, and this was because he was a racist. And could also be because, according to Tara, he viewed his daughters, his own daughters, his biological daughters, as property. He may not have viewed them that way because they were Rose's children. I'm not completely sure. But he did not sexually abuse those 3. However, their mother physically abused all of them. Although I don't know how much Luciana and Rosemary Jr. remember, but she did. The children that she had with her clients are more angry at Rose than they were at Fred. So when Stephen got older, he had a closer relationship with Fred, if you will. Poor Stephen. Like, I feel really bad for him because he would often help his dad dig out in the backyard without realizing what it was for. And he was taught at a very young age that stealing was okay. He would often go out and help Fred steal things. That was just the way it was. That was what he learned. He had some problems later on in life. But between the three children, at some point in time, they developed a system to get away from Fred's abuse. We're going to discuss that a little bit further on, but they did. When the girls got boyfriends, he would also like he'd be okay with that, he'd be happy with it, and he would basically tell them that they could sleep with his daughters whenever they wanted, invite them to live at the house, invite them to take home his pornographic movies and view them, things of that nature. So it was fine. So the kids spent hours and hours in their basement grave bedroom, guys. Hours. Because it was almost like children were to be seen and not heard. They were always talked about by how quiet and polite they were. Docile, if you will. They weren't supposed to talk to each other, but being kids, of course, they did find their ways of doing so. They were always forced to wear clothes that were not trendy, that were usually too big for them. Hobnailed shoes, which nobody wanted to wear because Rose didn't care, and she didn't care. It was almost like she was trying to make her daughters look less feminine. Maybe she thought subconsciously that would keep Fred away. I'm not totally sure, but she always made them have these really short haircuts that weren't necessarily even. Another one of the reasons is because it took too long to brush. She just didn't like that. She didn't want to do that. Shopping with Rose was, of course, a chore to be endured. Like I said, she never wore underwear, and the clothes, she would like literally rip and pull on them and try to find any flaws so she could call them crap. She loved to swear. She loved all of that stuff, to be brash, to be just horrible to salespeople and everybody else. She was very short. That was just the way she was with people. When she went to go answer the phone, it was never hello. It was always what? So it was very much a chore to have to endure going shopping with her. At about the age of 11, Anna was forced to have sexual contact with some of Rose's clients. And by 12 or 13, Rose was actually actively prostituting Anna. She was taking her out to bars to see clients. She'd dress her up, put on her makeup, get her drunk, and let people do things to her. On some of those occasions, Anna actually thought that Rose was trying to be a friend to her, but Rose would always beat her afterwards and be like, oh yeah, like as if we could ever be friends. Despite being sexually abused violently by her dad, she still loved him. She still had a bond with him. He was technically her favorite, and she did stand by him even after, and remained in contact with him even after his arrest. One of the most disturbing parts of the stories is the fact that the kids were relegated to these basement rooms over top of bodies. It's so incomprehensible to me, guys, that these are your kids and you are forcing them to sleep on dead bodies, and they had no idea. Like, I could not imagine that. Just, oh my God. Just, no. Fred kind of got rid of the lodgers by the end of 1975. Someone had called the council and ratted him out about his building permits and everything being crowded. So he ostensibly got rid of the lodgers. This made Rose happy, but they weren't really gone. He'd start inviting them in again later. So Fred and Bill Letts actually went into a business together. This was a cafe. It was called the Green Lantern. Bill lived at the West's house for a short period of time too. He actually left Daisy, which was fine by her. I mean, come on, he's an abusive, ridiculous man. She can't stand him. And she was happy to be left in peace. So he was living with the Wests. for a little bit of time. Fred was aware of the relationship between Bill and Rose, and he probably encouraged it. That was a big thing for him. I mean, Bill did it, so why couldn't Fred? The relationship soured a little bit, and Bill ended up living in the apartment over top of the cafe and actually taking it over as his own. A few years later, the cafe itself folded, but for a little while, Bill ran it himself, and Daisy actually would help him run it. So it's a very strange dynamic in that family. Now, the reason why he moved into that building was, according to him, according to Bill, he objected to 12-year-old Anna being abused by a much older man. According to Fred, it was Bill that was trying to abuse Anna, and he put a stop to it. It's probably somewhere in between there. I can't see Fred hating Bill trying to sleep with his daughter, but at the same point in time, Fred was sexually abusing Rose from a very young age, so I can't see him saying no to her having relations with an older man. Who can say exactly for sure? Maybe somewhere a blending of the two. Maybe Fred was a little jealous. I don't know. In any case, like I said, the cafe failed after a few years. And by 1977, you know, at least they didn't kill in 1976, I guess. Maybe took a year off because of the cafe. They were too busy. I'm not sure. By 1977, Rose was pregnant again, and Fred was back at his old job at the wheelworks. The cafe was run, like I said, by Bill and Daisy for a bit, but then it failed, and the two of them decided to retire in the forest, I believe to the Forest of Dean, and were living together again by that point in time. So that's it, guys. That's it for today. What do you think? What do you think the real reason was that Bill Letts left? Do you think that Rose was just as involved in the murders as Fred was? Do you think maybe she was more complicit? That seems to be my ideal. My thought that any point in time when Fred is maybe turning to somebody else, or maybe has an interest in somebody else, she seems to put a stop to it. However, they were both actively involved in the kidnapping and the raping. I believe they were both actively involved in the murder too. But we'll get more into that the next video. It's a lot, guys. Ooh, it's a lot. I bet you believe it's a lot too. So hopefully you guys will have a good next week. If you have any other questions, just let me know. You guys know that I'll try as hard as I can to answer them as best as I can. But what do you think of the story so far? What do you make of it? What do you make of the way the kids view their parents? Let me know down below. Until then, I will see you guys next week. Bye for now.